Welcome to The Truth in This Art Beyond, and we're back in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, and I'm your host, Rob Lee. Today, I am thrilled to be in conversation with my next guest, a sculptor based out of Philadelphia, who holds a bachelor's in religious studies from Grinnell College and an MFA in sculpture from MICA in Baltimore. Please welcome Alex Schechter. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on. Thank you for making the time. And, I'm a little jealous of the denim right now,
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah. Well, repping the whole cowboy thing, I guess. But.
Well, so as I get started here, I want to do sort of the introductory question before we get into like the main topic about your work and your creative background. But, tell us a little bit about your background and ultimately, what would one of those that first sort of art making or first experience around art, whether it's appreciating it, making it. So, your background and like that first experience where you're like, hey, art,
Yeah. Yeah. I'll talk a little bit about, I think that they're like kind of my story's kind of tied in with that. So I grew up, I'm the first person on a record to be born in the town of Moose, Wyoming. Which is, a tiny town, I think like 400, 500 people in northwestern Wyoming. I was like a home birth. So I grew up in northwestern Wyoming and was always a drawer. Grew up in a community that was kind of transitioning out of being an agricultural community into being really a tourism community. My mom raises horses. Grew up in a single parent household. My mom was always loved drawing, and so it was like a family activity. My brother, my mom, and I would always sit together and draw. My mom keeps really beautiful journals. But I never really saw it as like a career path or anything. I didn't really think I was going to go to college. Had a guidance counselor who kind of at last was like, you should wasn't a good student, but I tested well. So it was like, you got a good enough scores. You should apply to college or whatever. And I got in to a really small school in Iowa that was like very academically rigorous. I went in, and so I have a degree in religious studies, kind of nonsensically, but I ended up like just taking on a whim a sculpture class in college, and really fell in love with it. Had a great professor who was really encouraging and really kind of a big believer of like, oh yeah, no, you're an artist now. Like you're making stuff, you're putting it together, you're an artist. And that really kind of carried me. And so it was one of those things that I finished. I actually applied for grad school, not in art, and took a year off. And in that time was like, I really have no desire to go on and get a PhD, but I'm still making art. I'm still like staying up late at night, like on the side, and just making stuff. And so I don't know if there's like really one particular moment, but it was like, yeah, I'm staying up until 2 a.m. most nights, just like cutting up cardboard in my bedroom. And then I ended up applying for grad school and got in, and I've been doing it ever since.
Thank you. We're definitely going to tap back into some of that stuff, obviously, but definitely
for sure.
A good start for an overview. So. I see sculpture. I see that as the background. So could you describe your current work for those who are undipped?
Yeah. I'll talk about the work that I'm making right now. I'm making work in preparation for a solo show coming up. And I've been doing a lot of my background is in woodworking. My stepfather's a cabinet maker. And so I've been since kind of a teenager working in the wood shop. So right now I'm doing a combination of like wood carving, like very traditional carved wood material, and then like a lot of material transformations. So I'm making some pretty, like I'm making a 6 foot by 8 foot. It's basically a map of the continent Pangea, which is like the previous the continent when all the continents were squished together. But I figured out a way to chrome plywood. So it's plywood, and it's through using a process that they use to like make basically like hot rod cars. You can chrome it so you can actually get a mirror polish reflection on it.
Nice.
But yeah, a lot of my work is again based in woodworking. I'm very much like an object maker, like I make things, like physical things. I always joke to my students that like painters have it really easy. There's this material that is paint. There's none of this material that is sculpt. And so as a sculptor, you have like a million different things that you could be doing. So woodworking is like kind of my go-to. It's just like well, I need to make something fast. I can make it out of wood. That's easy for me. But I'm always trying to like push what the things that I can do with that and bring in other materials. I think my other like shtick, if you will, is I really like having found objects that look like that they were made by me, and then making objects that to look like that they were found objects. So yeah, a little bit. So I'll do a lot of like I've been like casting things to make them look like they're plants. Like I use a lot of house plants in my work, and sometimes they're cast objects, and sometimes they're actual house plants, and I like kind of that slippage between the two. So
I dig that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you touched on it a little bit earlier, the religious studies degrees. So talk about like having like both of those like educational backgrounds, and maybe it's the thinking, maybe it's like references, but how do they like serve each other? Where do they sort of intersect, if they intersect at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time I would have said that they don't, right? That the religious studies was like kind of this wasted youth, and I think in the last couple of years it's really turned around, and I realized that it's a big kind of lens for the way that I think about the world. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I think I like one of the things that we like you talk about in religious studies is the big three C's. So that's community, like who is in a group, cultus, which is like what are the rituals or the like ways that you use to organize some sort of situation or practices, or it's like what do you do in that? And then cosmology, which is like how do you describe the world that you're in,
right?
And I think those are really huge for me in thinking about ways that I'm making artwork. I think a lot of my work is kind of reflecting and playing with those big three. I talk about it a lot, but like I'm really interested in like the ways that, I mean, I'm American. We're in America. That we talk about as Americans, like the way it's like kind of the way that we describe ourselves and kind of our national origin stories, and the way that we kind of put those together. Because they are like for a lot of human history, like that's pretty inseparable from religion, right? Like kind of this idea of national identity and all of that, and religion are like there's not even an idea of separating them,
right?
But we have secularized that, and we have pulled those apart. But I think we still do a lot of that with national identity. That we describe in groups and out groups, that we describe like what do we do as like who are we as Americans in broader and then really in tight groups,
right?
And then like cosmology of like how do we orient the world, like who is good, who is bad, what is in, what is out, where did we come from, where are we going? And so I think a lot of my work is trying to take those big ideas and kind of cram them into these moments of kind of like small poetic moments that complicate all of those. I'd say like, oh, what is that origin story actually saying, or like what is it that we're actually upholding, and so yeah, I think I'm really interested in playing with those a lot. I also really like ritual as like ways that we go about doing things. I think that it's a lot of my work plays around with that, like, well, how did we get to this point? And what are the things how did we like actually stumble upon this? And what are we doing again and again and again?
So Thank you. Actually, so talk about some of the advantages and maybe some of the challenges in working with like various like mediums. You've touched on like almost first and foremost, it's like I got the wood, I'm here with the wood, and then kind of like going from there and implementing whether it be other objects and kind of taking a cue from sort of like plants and stuff you were referencing earlier. What are some of the advantages of working across like mediums and like sort of the parts that make up your work, and what are some of the disadvantages? Because I'm seeing like video and animation, I'm seeing found objects, digital fabrication, in addition to the woodworking.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the thing that I'm going to probably talk about teaching a lot because it's my day job. But it's also, I think, really important in my practice. And one of the things I'm always trying to talk to my students about is like, what can working in a medium let you do that other things can't? And I think that there are lots of like I work in a bunch of different media because they all let me do different things.
Yeah.
There's things that I can't do without. I mean, maybe I could. I just don't have the skill to do without digital fabrication, right? Like that, there's certain types of casting processes or carving processes or 3D printing that I can't do without kind of computer aided material. For a long time, I was working with AI and making AI films, and then 6 months ago, like AI really blew up, and I was like, oh man, like this, like I was like, well, I was really interested in kind of where AI was bad and like wasn't working super well, and kind of that kind of almost like uncanny place where it was like, oh, what's like, I don't know. I think the most interesting thing happening with AI right now is like the places where like people's hands in AI images are really messed up. Like you can see that like there's something wrong, and there's like this gut visceral reaction. That's way more exciting to me than like, can I copy an image or can I really rapidly generate something?
Yeah.
I it's almost been disappointing that that AI has taken up a lot of this space of like, oh, can I just generate images? Because I don't know. I've gone on a sidetrack about AI, but I think it gets back to media of like, what is it like? People are really creative. People can do a lot,
Yeah.
and that working in different media, like there's things that video allows you to do that I can't really do with a stationary object, right? Stationary objects are not very like woodworking is really hard to tell a longer narrative with. I can do that with working in video. I can do that in doing kind of more performative work.
Yeah.
I can't. I can like do stuff with projects that use houseplants and like microcontrollers that I can't do with casting processes, or that I can't do with film or animation. And so I guess I'm always interested in getting to sort of the idea or the poetic moment first, and then like, what is the thing that's going to allow me to do that?
Yeah.
I think like the reverse of that is that like sometimes I'm just playing. I like to play, and like one of my kind of like New Year's resolutions was like allow myself play in the studio more, just like put stuff together and see what comes out, because I think that space of play is really helpful of like, oh, I'm discovering that I can do this with this material. So I think the combination of those, figuring out play to let it like discover what is possible, and then being like, oh, how do I use that thing that is now possible to tell a different story?
No, I like that. I think like because it has me thinking. So thank you, teacher. With this sort of notion of if what I might deem what I'm doing here is it may be journalism, it may be storytelling, or what have you. Like I got to a point where I started to shy away from the idea of I'm a podcaster, this is a podcast, because it gets deprecated. People have deemed it to be something that's not valid in a certain way. It's content versus there's a creative intent or creative like sort of goal there. But in it, if I said, and I won't because I don't really like video per se, but I could do that same thing through video. I could do that same thing through text. I can do the same thing, but I choose to do it through audio. I prefer audio. I can do the same thing through, let's say, a narrative film, perhaps even a play. It can extend into all of these different areas, and just really being able to incorporate play in there. And I like that you said that. I think play is so important, and I think sometimes in doing, I don't know if you're a sports guy, but it's like when someone had too many fights, been in a ring too many rounds.
Sure.
Sometimes it's that vibe when you do like a few too many interviews and you start losing the fun piece that's in there. And it's like, how can I make this play again? How can I add this like degree of difficulty in there? Which, I've been comparing like the process of learning something new or trying something new, or even getting back to something that you had, very similar to when you go to the gym. It's gonna suck to start, and when you get back to it, or have you, but ultimately those are rewards there at the end of that. You're gonna get there, and that's the way that I start kind of looking at things. But really, it's let's get back to play.
Yeah.
Let's get back to play, because I think it opens something up that you may have missed along the way, and it's like, oh yeah, I can stretch the boundaries of this. This is gonna make me a better woodworker. This is gonna make me a better podcaster.
Do you feel like you can do that within that, like, this format? Have you found a place so you can return to play within that?
There are pieces of it where I think it turns on, the problem solving button is what's turned on. Or even if I just like go into like I sent you the questions obviously beforehand,
right?
But let's say if I have like, I got 2 questions, but I'm trying to get like a 35-minute, 40-minute interview out of it, I'm gonna be like kind of free jazz, and I'll be improvising the entire time, which kind of connects to something that I used to do a lot. Like a podcast that I used to do was almost 100% improv. We'd have like certain stories that we would look at, but really we're coming up with jokes off the top of our head. And it's like, this just felt like pure fun. It just felt like just us playing, but really the output at the end of the day is this sort of creative contribution.
Yeah. I mean, I think about that a lot too, with like, I think in my like most cynical or like kind of darkest hours, I think of myself as a little bit of a dilettante, right? Like I'm jumping between all of these things. And I mean, what you were saying about jazz, I think I'm sometimes a little bit jealous of that. People who are just like so comfortable within their medium that they're just like, I have complete freedom, and I can just play endlessly in this space. And like I have some skills in doing things, but I'm also, I think sometimes it's good that I'm really curious. I'm always wanting to expand and try new things and stuff. But sometimes I'm just like, man, you like I have friends who are just like incredible like metal workers, and they're just like, oh yeah, anything I can just do that. Because like, and then I can play around with them. It's like, oh wow, all right, that is incredible.
And I think part of it is like sort of like the curiosity thing of, I asked this question, like what drives a lot of the work or the thinking behind the work? Is it passion? Is it curiosity? Is it a mixture of both? And it's, it may have, for me, I think it may have started off as purely like passion. I'm very passionate about people having their voices heard and sharing their stories and giving the space to share their stories. And then it starts to shift a little bit into curiosity of, how do you make that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back, or how far can I do this? How many episodes can I do? When will I get tired? Will I get tired of sort of even pursuing this? So when you start looking at like your work or anything that you're pursuing, because it seems like you're always kind of tinkering. It feels like tinkering's the part of what you do. What drives it? Is it the passion? Is it sort of curiosity on what the limits might be, what the parameters might be, the boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's what is driving me. It's 2 things. I'm a curious person. I'm always like, I mean, the downside of it is that I'm an overthinker, but I'm always interested in things, and I always like want to be like, well, what's this? Like, what's this thing? What's this thing? Like doing more research or reading about things or seeing a film. I'm always just like, oh, what I want to learn all about this. And I think that for me, making art is the way that I can synthesize that in new ways, and that I can kind of add to that conversation. Um, I think one of the really exciting things about art and what I try to do with my work is kind of I'm I mean, I think basically like I'm just making metaphors, right? I'm just saying like, well, what if this thing is this thing? And there's like a spark that happens within that, right? That like when you're like, I mean even like the very like easy example is like when we take a thing and we transform it into a different material, there's something like in like the human brain that's just like, oh, now I think about that completely differently. When I take a marble statue and I create it like remake it in resin and in wood, like there's this shift that happens in there. When I take a house plant and hook it up to microcontrollers and have it like activating lights based on its internal biorhythms, like that is a different thing that is happening. And all of a sudden like there's something that happens where I have a different understanding of that.
Yeah.
And so for me it's I mean like the kind of most pure example is just like going on a walk with a friend and seeing something weird and like pointing at it being like, look, that's unexpected.
Right.
And I think that like basically my artistic practice is just getting a wider audience that I can point at a weird thing that's happening and being like, whoa, check this out, did you see this?
But that brings me to, and I like the weird stuff. That brings me to this question, and see, now I'm just improvising, by the way, but it brings me to this question that I'm very, very, very curious about, on like as a fellow overthinker and generating as being an ideator, right? Like, what sort of like, it's like what sort of practices, and I'll give you an example. What sort of practices do you engage in to kind of help you rein it in, or kind of help you like kind of stretch, using the exercise analogy yet again? I've heard of the 30 circles. I do one myself. So the 30 circles is, you have the paper, and then you get like 30 circles, and it's like you got 3 minutes, draw what you can draw in there. And it kind of, it's the brainstorming thing. And one of the things I like to do is I'll see, let's say I'm in a room, and I'll look for a word that really sticks out, and I'll try to see how many words I can come out of that, the larger word. Like, how can I unscramble that? How many words can I get out of it? And it helps like kind of open up my thinking. It takes out any of these parameters that I might have, that can block that creative flow. Do you have any practices that you engage in when you're just getting started, or even engaging in the process?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think of anything as like as specific or as disciplined as that, but I mean, I have a very clear answer, which is that I was keeping a sketchbook. I think I have all of my sketchbooks from age like 8. I'm 34, so from age 8 to 34, with the exception of 3. One I left in the parking lot of a Walmart in Araby outside of New Orleans. And then 2, I got mugged outside of my house and they stole my backpack. I got everything else back except like I got my wallet back, I got my phone back. I didn't get a library book back, and I didn't get my sketchbooks back. Which was like on some level, like on a insurance wise, an absolute like zero cost thing. And it was a personal thing, like devastating. That's an aside, but I'm a big sketchbooker. Yeah. I'm constantly drawing. I'm taking notes eons before I start on a sculptural, anything sculptural. I've done 30 different drawings of it. And some of them are really rendered, some much more illustrative. Some are just lists and notes, and but that's really, really important to me, and that's a place where I can like figure out a lot of those things. Yeah. And kind of go through iterations and chew through things, and it's the place where when I am feeling stuck for ideas, I have 2 decades of sketchbooks that I can go back through and mine for things. And that's a really, really important practice, for lack of a better word, that is the way of doing it. And then like recently I've been actually just trying to have finished drawings more, because it is work that I don't know that I'll I have no real plans of showing them, or I don't know where they exist really, but they're really a good way of, again, kind of working through ideas and sort of quieting my mind, of letting myself kind of be like, oh, okay, this is getting a thing without being kind of as ever expansive as I want to do. It's, I'm confined to just a piece of paper, or confined to just a piece of paper. So I think that is sometimes helpful for just making me like, okay, I'm doing one thing right now, and it is limited to 9 inches by 12 inches or what have you.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You know, I think, having sort of those boundaries that are there, and you know, I always talk about sort of this digital analog thing where, I think like I have my notepad right here. I have like different things, and I think I had to come to this conclusion at one point. You know how people will pull out the notes app and they would just type idea. You're leaving stuff. You're leaving
Yeah.
stuff out, where, because that's the more polished idea, because it's like, oh, I'd rather have the typos in there.
Yeah.
I think when I find one of my old sketchbook, and also screw those book bandits from earlier, but when I find like an old sketchbook or something that I had notes on, usually it's when you have sort of, what is it, these high focus tasks and low focus tasks. So, also obviously having a day job as well, I'm like, I'm in a meeting, time to create stuff, time to draw. Yeah. And I'll see, so I'll draw, like, it's always me drawing like a face. And I don't know what the face represents or whatever, but it's me drawing a face. And I'll just like start jotting down. That's almost the activator. I'll start jotting down different little ideas. I'm like, okay, that could be a podcast. Maybe that's a 10-part series. Maybe I should take this angle. Maybe I should name it this, and all of these different things. And then when I come back to it, I like hiding it. I like finding it later. And it's like, oh, right, I did work on that. You know what? I should do that podcast. And it may not even happen, but at least it jogs me out of when I run into an instance of creative, like a lack of creative confidence, or whatever the thing might be. I think seeing it's like, oh, it still does work. I did do this.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also this, I think that the sketchbook is a really freeing space too of, there's this ecosystem that we have of social media, where there's this constant, like, again, creating content, which actually, like, I think that there's a lot of benefits of Instagram. I think that there's a lot of ways that, like, Instagram, like, really has, like, democratized art in a pretty interesting way. It's like, oh yeah, like, I'm scrolling through something and I see Beyonce, and then I see my friend's dog, and then I see someone else's sketch. I think that's actually really cool.
Sure.
But I don't really post from my sketchbook that often, because it's just a place where I don't have to worry about other things being seen, and I can really just, like, make doodles of faces that I'm not worried about, like, someone gonna think this is good or someone not, like, and it's a way of like, this is a 0 like post, but it's okay because it's just for me, or maybe a 1 like post. Sometimes I like what I make.
I like and save. Yeah. So obviously, I at least this is what I believe. I think whenever we engage in something, and you were talking, like, having this sort of 2-decade repository, 2 decade plus, repository of, like, just ideas, thoughts, and whether it's in sketchbooks and so on. It's definitely connected to who you are, and it shows sort of the matriculation, right? Who you were maybe at this age to this age and so on. Ultimately, what does your work say about Alex the person?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm interested. I'm interested in that kind of, that differentiation between the personal and the artistic. I'm really interested in people who have, like, an artistic persona. Like, I know some people who are like, I have this identity that is the art person, and then that's different from, who I am in my daily life. Yeah. I'm sometimes a little jealous of that, because, like, oh, that just seems so clear, and then, like, I can just be stating things. I think in the work that I make, there's definitely a lens that it's filtering through it, and some of that lens is just time and editing. as I was kind of mentioning before, like the work that I make is very much a way of me processing the world, and it's very much a filtering of what am I interested in right now? What do I find as aspirational? I'm really interested in kind of ideas of utopia, and like not that I think that utopia is like even like an attainable idea, but I think at my core of my like rotten little soul, like my wrinkled black little heart is still this kind of spark of like I really want to be aspirational towards things. Um, and I think that my work is, even when it's critical of things, it's still pointing towards, this idea of better things are possible, or more interesting things are possible, or more empathy is possible. Um, and so I think that is the space of, when you're talking about like what does it say about me? I'm ultimately a fairly hopeful person despite everything, you know? And I think that's where when my work is at its best is that it is pretty hopeful, even if that hope is just like, let's be empathetic,
Yeah.
and um let's have ways that we are more like that we are, kind of more feeling towards each other, or more understanding of each other.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I try to think about I try to think about like this podcast in a way where I'm constantly framing between, because it's always, you never get the full definitive, this is the all encompassing interview of all time.
For sure, for sure.
There's no way it could be that, right? And I like to look at it as this is a sort of stamp at that time. And,
Yeah.
I could do this interview with you a year from now, and it could be, it's going to be some things that are still similar because you've lived that experience, but also maybe your perspective is going to be a little different. It's like, I'm all black heart now.
It's all just rotted. Well, it's interesting too to have you changing over time too, right? That like you as the filter for all of these conversations, like that's going to change from day to day or week to week, or
Yeah, as we talked a little bit before we got started, the fact that this is part of this sort of Philly batch of interviews that wasn't what I was doing initially. So having sort of those sensibilities and speaking with artists and creative folks that are up there, and I'm based in Baltimore, some of that kind of creeps in of, oh, this is what they're doing up there. Maybe this is a different context. And this sort of conversation that I may have, something you may say may pop up in a conversation like later, like, yeah, so I was talking to A Schechter, right? And then he said this, and somehow it pops up in conversation, you become a reference point. That's what we all want to be, reference points. But,
yeah.
I think even early on, not having some of the words or some of the exposure to even like go beyond the sort of de facto, the defunct sort of. So tell me about your work. Yeah, I want to know about that, but also I want to know the thinking that goes into it. I want to know who the person is, because that's a role in it. And I think I think some of the best work, I guess, when we have parts of ourselves in it, I think that's important. So like if I'm doing this and none of my sensibilities in it, none of my humor is in it, you take me out of it, it's not really something I can put my stamp on, because
Yeah.
it offers me. And I say that, and to go back to something you were touching on earlier, I think of AI, right? So at a point, I've talked to folks, there are podcasts that are AI podcasts now. You tell them the type of voice, you give them a script, and they'll do a podcast for you. It blows my mind. And I know some people who will put in like a guest bio and say, give me 10 interesting questions. And they'll do a podcast interview based off of that. And they'll lose their voice in that.
I guess my question with that is like, why are we automating the fun things? Like, let's automate like, the boring drudgery. Like, if I wish there was an AI bot that could do my taxes, that would be so sick.
Right.
But like for making art or doing a podcast, like those are the fun parts of life. Like why generate that automatically? I don't know, man.
Because you lose the thing that makes you you. That's why it's again, yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
something about the person being a part of it. It's like, sure, I could produce this well-produced podcast with these chat AI questions, these chat GPT questions. And
Right.
it's something that's missing in it. It's something, whether it's the sensibility, whether it's just I'm gonna fumble through a word,
Yeah.
so like too polished. I like the imperfections. I like sort of the, oh, that was a very stupid question I asked, but I'm gonna ask it in a. I'm gonna double down on it.
Yeah.
I think it's something important about keeping the you in sort of the work, and whether it's your perspective, whether it's the way that you go about things. I think it's something important about keeping that in there. And it could be as simple something as simple as, yeah, let me read over my notes from this note. Oh, I did scratch that out.
Yeah.
It's still you. So I got two more real questions because we were just free jazz, and I'm like, oh wow. And I was like, so this is the one. Can you share some of your recent influences? Like, are there any specific works, visual art, literature, film, music that you find important that maybe finds its way into how you approach your work? It may not directly, but maybe it does. And maybe it's like, look, I'm going to have this visual from this movie and this sort of,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I can share a couple. I think the most direct one, a couple of months ago, I read Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which is kind of a retelling of parts of the Iliad. And then because of that, I was like, oh, I have not read the Iliad since I was forced to in high school. I'm gonna reread it. And I was really taken with it, and in a way that I didn't think that I would be interested, or like certainly was not when I read it in high school. And the thing that was really, it's all about prophecy, right? It's all about these people who are told something is going to happen.
Mhm.
That thing is going to happen. Turns out it does happen, and they're still dealing with it. They still have to live a life that like when things are predetermined. Um, and it's gotten me. I mean, I'm making a lot of work about that, specifically about that idea right now. But it's got me thinking a lot about like things like what is out of our control, and so many things are out of our control, and we still have to live our lives. I think a lot about climate change. I deal with young people all the time, right? My students are all 19, 20 years old. They're they're existentially terrified of just like what is the world that I am going into. Um, and it's frustrating, right? Like I can recycle all that I want, and I mean, it's gonna do very little in the long run. But I still have to live. We still have to live our lives, and we still have to do things. And I think about that with like things like being in relationships that we know are like not good for us, but we still are, and they're going to end, right? But we still are kind of going through this. And so I think that specifically has been a really important thing of, as I said earlier, I think at my heart I'm an optimist, but what do we do with like what's the limit of that optimism, and how can we find meaning when things are so overwhelming and we know what the outcome is going to be?
Yeah,
Um,
it's good. Yeah.
the other book that I've been reading really recently, kind of going back to the utopian ideas, it's this book, Hammer and Hoe by Robin Kelly, which is about in the 1930s and 40s in Alabama, black communists who are, and just thinking about like kind of ways of organizing. And I mean, I've been living in the South for the last 6 months, and we have such like specific ideas of kind of red state and blue state, and I think that being a really expansive idea of like what are the ways that people are organizing themselves, and what are the ways that politics are happening that have a lot of politics of empathy and that are kind of utopian, even if they are not like kind of bucking the trend of what we think of as traditional organizing. I think that's been really really important for me of just kind of both kind of my own personal politics and then just thinking about assumptions that I have around things and really challenging those. And then visually, I've been rewatching a lot of Tarkovsky movies. He's so good. Like, man, all the sculptures I want to make are just like things that are in the background of those movies. They're just like so beautiful. And sometimes it's okay to just like want to make beautiful things, I think. Like sometimes I just like, oh, it's all right to just be like, that looks really good. I want to make a thing that looks good. And it's like pristine and clean and polished. And so those are the things that I think have been really kicking around in my brain a lot recently.
Thank you. So this is the last real question and that I have for this portion of the podcast. And the question goes like this. It goes a little something like this. Tell us about the and I'm going to modify it a little bit. Tell us about like typically like what does like, so let's say this week, this is we're recording this on a Monday. What does a typical Monday look like for you? How does it start off? What's in it? I know, maybe teaching, maybe working, so on, but what is typically what a Monday looks like for you?
Yeah. I'm a fairly early riser. So I usually get up around like 6:30 or so. And I'm also a putterer. So I like listen to some music and drink some coffee and just kind of like, slowly move around. This morning I had a staff meeting or a faculty meeting about some nonsense. And so I was in my sketchbook a lot, just like doodling things and started off taking very serious notes. And then it was like drawing like stick figure vampire rabbits or whatever. Clearly doing the important work. Mondays, I don't have classes. And so it's actually generally a studio day. And because I've been doing this kind of like weird, I gave up my studio in Philadelphia and I've been like in this kind of weird in between space. So I'm just working in the studio space. So my workflow is kind of a mixture of doing my own thing and working on my own projects and then answering questions when students kind of walk into the room, and then I'll talk with them for a little bit. And then I'll put on very loud music, which is my don't bug me type of thing. And it's it's either like I listen to a lot of like really intense doom metal or top 40s pop. Like it's either like Panopticon and just like loud doom metal, or it's FKA Twigs and just like bumping it, dancing. But that's kind of my like my signal of just like you have to like come up and at least ask me to pause the music before I answer questions about when's this next assignment due. It's all in the syllabus is generally my answer. But yeah, and then I know there's people who are like, I'm a morning person or I'm a night person. I'm a solid like 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's like my real like ability to do anything type of hours. So I'll usually do a combination of like school type of work and then studio work until the evening. And then yeah, it's also helpful for me to have like a couple of I'm not going to diagnose myself, but it's sometimes very difficult for me to stick to single tasks. So I often have a couple of projects that I can kind of bounce between, which is really useful for me because I can just kind of direct that wandering attention to multiple things and just kind of do a little circuit. So yeah, today I was doing some sanding and bondoing and patching things, and then at the same time with like doing surface prep for other projects. And then the evening, I usually try to get some sort of exercise, go for a run or something. And then I make dinner, and then I generally draw for at least 2 or 3 hours before I go to bed.
Thank you.
I'm very, yeah, I was going to say, I'm a very, I live in a small town rural South Carolina at the moment. So it's very studio focused for the last 6 months, and will continue to be for until May. So,
well, thank you. So I want to shift into the rapid fire portion of the pod.
sure.
I got three of them for you. I got three questions for you.
Great.
So going back to when you were a student, what was your favorite subject in school?
Oh, probably English. I really like reading. It's kind of the only, yeah, my only saving grace as a student. So I'll say English literature.
Okay. Let's see. Where have you lived for the longest, like period of time?
Other than Wyoming, I lived in Wyoming till I was 17, and then Philadelphia is the other place that I've lived for long. I've bounced around a lot. I've lived in a lot of cities, but Philadelphia is the place I've lived the longest as an adult.
That's why I wanted to ask that question. I was like, oh. So this is the last one because I'm always interested in, what people eat. So let's say, super long day. You've been up since 6. It's just like, all right, I got a couple hours. I got to figure out this dinner situation. What is the go-to lazy dinner for you?
Oh man, I think so. There's a big depending is that I live in Philadelphia. I live with my partner, and I'm much more willing to cook a meal for the both of us. Here I'm like full on bacheloring, and it is opening a can of black beans and heating it up, maybe like throwing some salsa in there, and then a big like pile of spinach that like sometimes I'll just like like sometimes I won't even like sit down. I'll just like eat it over the stove and just like shove it into my mouth and just stare into the middle distance. So that's the I've opened up a lot. I've been very vulnerable of how like weird and sad my eating habits are. But if I'm cooking for my partner, I'll often make like a stir fry. I'll do some tofu and broccoli and one other vegetable, and then over rice. I think is like a good like easy night meal.
I like that. So that's pretty much all I have. Nice little mixture here, real life, smart talk, all of that good stuff. But I want to thank you for coming onto the pod, spending some time with me. And I want to invite and encourage you to share with the listeners where they can check you out, your work, social media, all of that good stuff. The floor is yours.
I was going to say, I do have a solo show opening up in Philadelphia in June, I think June 8th, but I'm not 100% sure, at Peep Projects. It's in the Crane Arts building. So if you're in Philadelphia in early June, please come to that. It'll be up through the end of July. Otherwise, the only social media I'm really on is Instagram, and that's J Schechter. So hit me up there. And then, there's links and stuff on my Instagram.
And there you have it, folks. I want to again thank Alex Schechter for coming on to the podcast. And I'm Rob Lee, saying that there's art and culture in and around your neck of the woods. You've just got to look for it.